Nietzsche did not describe nihilism as a final destination. He described it as a passage, a moment in which inherited values lose their authority and life is left without a clear direction. This moment feels like emptiness, but Nietzsche did not think it should be mistaken for nothingness. Nihilism does not mean that life has no value. It means that the old sources of value no longer convince the modern soul. Religious meaning weakens. Traditional morality loses its weight. Cultural certainties dissolve. What remains is not chaos, but exposure. Human beings are no longer held by a single unquestioned truth. They must face existence without a ready-made why. Nietzsche saw this as dangerous but also necessary, because as long as values are inherited, they are not chosen. They are obeyed, but not affirmed. Nihilism begins when this obedience collapses. It appears when the mind can no longer believe in the values it repeats. This creates a gap between life and meaning. People continue to live, but without inner justification. Effort remains, but purpose weakens. Nietzsche believed this gap was one of the defining conditions of modern humanity. Not because modern life is worse, but because it is more conscious. Once meaning becomes questionable, it can no longer return to innocence. This is why nihilism is not simply despair. It is a form of awareness, an awareness that what once guided life no longer has unquestioned force. This awareness feels heavy because it removes certainty. But Nietzsche did not think certainty was the same as truth. Default text. He believed that much of human history was shaped by values that were accepted because they were necessary, not because they were chosen. Religion gave structure, morality gave order, tradition gave direction. These systems made life bearable, but they also limited it. Nihilism appears when these systems lose their inner authority. This does not happen overnight. It happens slowly. People continue to speak the old language of values, but their faith in it weakens. Words remain. Conviction fades. This produces a quiet crisis. Not rebellion, but fatigue. Life becomes repetitive. Goals feel mechanical. Success feels empty. Nietzsche did not see this as a failure of character. He saw it as a historical condition. Humanity had outgrown its inherited meanings, but had not yet created new ones. This is why nihilism feels transitional. It is not the end of meaning. It is the end of borrowed meaning. What follows is not automatically clarity. It is uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable because it demands responsibility. If no higher authority decides what matters, the individual must decide. This is the moment Nietzsche considered decisive. Human beings can respond in two ways. They can retreat into comfort and small goals, or they can confront the emptiness and attempt to create new values. The first response is passive nihilism. The second opens the path beyond nihilism. Nietzsche believed that most people would choose the first path, not because they are weak, but because uncertainty is exhausting. Comfort feels safer than creation. Routine feels easier than responsibility. But Nietzsche was not writing for comfort. He was writing for those who could endure this moment without collapsing. To endure nihilism means to remain in the absence of meaning without filling it too quickly. Not with distraction, not with new dogmas, not with borrowed ideals, but with attention, with the willingness to see life without illusion. This is why nihilism is not only destructive, it clears space, it removes false certainties, it strips away values that no longer correspond to lived experience. In this sense, nihilism is not a doctrine, it is a purification. It shows what no longer works. It reveals what no longer persuades. It forces the question, if nothing is given, what can be affirmed? Nietzsche did not believe that this question could be answered by reason alone. He did not think logic could create values. Values for him are not conclusions, they are orientations, ways of standing in life. of ways of enduring struggle, ways of giving shape to effort. This is why nihilism is not solved by ideas. It is moved beyond by transformation, not transformation of the world, but transformation of the self. Nietzsche believed that only a human being who has passed through nihilism can truly begin to shape their own becoming, because before nihilism, life is guided by inheritance. After nihilism, life must be guided by choice. This is the threshold we now stand before. Not a threshold of happiness, not a threshold of salvation, but a threshold of responsibility to become what one is, not in the sense of discovering a hidden essence, but in the sense of forming a direction from within life itself. Tonight, you do not need to pass this threshold. You do not need to decide what you will become. It is enough to recognize that nihilism is not the end. It is a space where something new can appear. The body does not need meaning to rest. The breath does not need values to slow. And the mind can remain for a moment inside this openness without fear. Nihilism does not ask for despair. It asks for honesty. And honesty, for now, can take the form of stillness. Nietzsche believed that creation does not begin with invention. It begins with removal. Before something new can appear, something old must lose its authority. This is not a violent destruction. It is not a call to chaos. It is a slow loosening of what once felt unquestionable. Old values do not disappear because someone attacks them. They disappear because they no longer convince. They remain in language, but not in feeling. They remain in rules, but not in belief. Nietzsche saw this as the true beginning of transformation, not when a new ideal is announced, but when an old one quietly collapses. This is why nihilism appears first. It clears the ground by revealing that what once guided life no longer holds it. Morality loses its certainty. Truth loses its absoluteness. Purpose loses its inheritance. This does not immediately create freedom. It creates emptiness. An emptiness that can feel dangerous because it removes orientation. Human beings prefer direction to openness. They prefer rules to responsibility. This is why many try to replace old values as quickly as possible, with new ideologies, with political beliefs, with rigid identities. Nietzsche saw this as a mistake. Replacing one system with another does not overcome nihilism, it only hides it. Because the problem is not which value system we choose. The problem is that values are no longer unquestionable. They must be justified from within life itself. This is why Nietzsche believed that destruction must come first, not as an act of hatred, but as an act of honesty. What no longer corresponds to lived experience must fall away. Otherwise, creation becomes imitation. A new structure built on an old foundation will inherit its weakness. Nietzsche did not want new commandments. He wanted new orientations, not rules to follow, but forces to live by. For this, the mind must first learn to stand without support, to endure uncertainty without rushing into belief. This endurance is what separates transformation from substitution. Destruction, in Nietzsche's sense, is not breaking the world. It is breaking dependence on inherited meaning. It is the refusal to pretend that old values still guide life when they no longer do. This refusal feels uncomfortable. It creates anxiety. It creates instability. But Nietzsche saw this discomfort as necessary. Because comfort preserves what no longer works. It keeps life inside worn-out forms. Only when these forms are loosened can something different appear. Nietzsche believed that the modern soul was standing inside this loosening, not fully destroyed, but no longer supported. Religion weakened, morality thinned, tradition lost authority. Human beings were left with freedom they did not ask for, freedom to define what is worth living for. But freedom without form feels like loss. This is why destruction is experienced as crisis, not because values vanish, but because guidance vanishes. The danger is not that nothing will be created. The danger is that people will flee back into old systems out of fear. Nietzsche thought this fear was understandable. Human beings want stability. They want to know what is right, what is wrong, what matters. But Nietzsche believed that clinging to weakened values creates a life of pretense, a life that repeats forms without inner belief. This is what he wanted to overcome, not belief itself, but borrowed belief. Destruction, in this sense, is an inner act. It is the recognition that certain ideals no longer hold the soul. It is the willingness to say, "This no longer guides me," not in anger, not in rebellion, but in clarity. This clarity is not immediately productive. It does not give direction. It only removes illusion. But illusion is heavy. It fills the mind with answers that no longer persuade. When illusion falls away, silence appears. And in silence, the question becomes real. What can I affirm without inheritance? Nietzsche did not believe this question could be answered by society. Society depends on stability. New values do not come from the collective. They come from individuals who can endure the collapse of old ones. This is why destruction comes before creation. Creation requires ground, but that ground must be cleared of false support. Otherwise, new values become old values in new language. This shaping does not begin with certainty. It begins with exposure. The human being exposed to existence without answers. This is why destruction is not the enemy of life. It is the beginning of seriousness. A seriousness that does not accept ready-made meaning. A seriousness that wants to stand inside life without illusion. Tonight, you do not need to destroy beliefs. You do not need to question your values. It is enough to notice that some answers feel thinner than they once did, and that this thinning is not failure. It is the beginning of transformation. The body does not need new values to rest. The breath does not need new meaning to slow. And the mind can remain for a moment inside the space where old forms loosen without rushing to replace them. Destruction does not demand action in the night. It only asks for awareness, and awareness for now can take the form of quiet. After destruction has cleared the ground, something remains. Not a rule, not a command, not a new belief. What remains is movement. Nietzsche believed that life does not simply endure. It tends toward form. It seeks to shape itself. This tendency is not moral. It is not rational. It is not chosen in advance. It is lived. He called this inner tendency the will to become, not the will to survive, not the will to obey, but the will to grow into form. When inherited meanings collapse, this movement becomes more visible. Without external direction, life must rely on its own force, not on tradition, not on law, not on divine command, but on inner orientation. Nietzsche did not think human beings could live without direction, but he did think they could learn to generate direction from within life itself. The will to become is not ambition. It is not success. It is not the desire to dominate others. It is the impulse to shape oneself through experience, to turn resistance into form, to turn struggle into structure. This does not happen through planning. It happens through living. Nietzsche believed that every life interprets itself through what it chooses to endure, through what it chooses to repeat, through what it chooses to abandon. Becoming is not a project. It is a process, not something one decides, something one forms over time. This is why Nietzsche did not speak of a fixed human essence. He did not believe that there is a stable self waiting to be discovered. He believed that the self is shaped through overcoming, through tension, through effort, through resistance. Without resistance, there is no form. Without struggle, there is no depth. Comfort preserves, but it does not create. When nihilism appears, this movement is threatened, not because life stops, but because it loses its aim. Energy remains, but direction fades. The will continues, but it does not know what to move toward. This creates stagnation, not because life has failed, but because it is undecided. Nietzsche believed that the task after nihilism is not to restore old meaning, but to allow this inner movement to take shape again, not through borrowed ideals, not through abstract systems, but through lived orientation. The will to become does not ask, "What should I believe?" It asks, "What kind of life can I affirm?" Affirmation is not happiness. It is not comfort. It is the ability to endure one's life without rejecting it, to say yes not to pleasure, but to process, to the fact that life forms itself through struggle. Nietzsche believed that modern humanity was losing this ability, not because it suffered too much, but because it avoided suffering. When pain is seen only as something to be removed, life loses its shaping force. Struggle becomes meaningless. Effort becomes mechanical. The will becomes weak not because it is oppressed, but because it is unused. The will to become requires difficulty, not cruelty, not chaos, but resistance, something that forces life to take shape. Nietzsche did not glorify suffering. He believed suffering could destroy or create. The difference lies in how it is interpreted. If suffering is seen as punishment, it weakens. If suffering is seen as meaningless, it empties. But if suffering is seen as part of becoming, it can give form. This does not justify pain. It gives it orientation. The will to become is not about seeking hardship. It is about not fleeing from what shapes. To become what one is does not mean to discover a hidden nature. It means to give shape to one's life through engagement. Nietzsche did not imagine this as a smooth path. Becoming involves tension between what is and what could be, between habit and transformation, between comfort and form. This tension cannot be removed without flattening life. That is why Nietzsche feared a world that eliminates struggle, not because struggle is good, but because without it, life loses direction. When nihilism appears, the danger is not despair. The danger is numbness, a life that continues without forming itself. The will to become is the opposite of numbness. It is the quiet insistence that life must take shape, not according to rules, but according to strength. Not strength over others, but strength to endure, strength to remain engaged, strength to shape meaning through existence itself. This is not a task for tonight. You do not need to shape your life. You do not need to overcome anything. It is enough to notice that beneath thought there is movement. Breath moves, blood moves, time moves. Life continues even when meaning is unclear. The will to become does not shout. It does not command. It remains as a quiet tendency toward form. Sleep does not interrupt this movement. It supports it. The body restores itself. The mind loosens its grip. Becoming does not require constant effort. It requires rhythm. Rest is part of movement. Tonight you do not need to decide who you will become. It is enough to rest inside the awareness that life is not static. It shapes itself even in stillness, and meaning, when it returns, will not come from belief. It will come from form. Nietzsche did not understand life as something that moves toward a final state. He did not think existence had a finished form waiting at the end. For him, life was not a destination. It was a movement, not something to reach, but something to shape while moving. This is why he rejected the idea that meaning could be fixed once and for all. A fixed meaning would turn life into a task to complete. But Nietzsche believed life does not complete itself. It transforms itself. When people lose inherited meaning, they often search for a new goal, a new final answer, a new ultimate purpose. Nietzsche thought this was a misunderstanding. The problem was not that a goal was missing. The problem was that life had been treated as something that should end in one. Religious meaning promised salvation. Moral meaning promised righteousness. Progress promised perfection. All of these imagined a final state in which life would be justified. Nietzsche believed this way of thinking made life dependent on something outside itself. Meaning was always placed beyond life, either in heaven or in history or in morality. But when these external goals weaken, life feels empty. Not because it has no value, but because its value was always postponed. Nietzsche wanted to bring meaning back into movement itself, not into an end point, but into becoming. Life, for him, is not something to be completed. It is something that continuously forms itself through effort, tension, and interpretation. This is why he did not ask, "What is the final meaning of life?" He asked, "What kind of life can be affirmed?" Affirmation does not require a final goal. It requires engagement. To affirm life is to accept that it does not lead to rest, that it does not resolve into clarity, that it remains open. When nihilism appears, people often feel that something essential is missing. They feel as if life should point somewhere and no longer does. Nietzsche believed this feeling came from confusing process with purpose. Life does not point, it moves. And meaning for him was not a signpost. It was a way of moving. This is why he saw danger in lives that exist only for outcomes, success, recognition, completion. These turn life into a waiting room. One end is always anticipated. The present is only preparation. Nietzsche believed this weakens the will, because effort becomes instrumental. One struggles not to become, but to arrive. But arrival never truly happens. Each goal, once reached, becomes another starting point. This is not failure. It is the nature of life. Nietzsche thought that only a life understood as process could be lived without resentment. If life is seen as a path toward a final state, then every difficulty feels like delay. Every pain feels unjustified. But if life is seen as formation, then difficulty becomes part of shape. Not something to be escaped, but something that gives contour. This does not mean that suffering is good. It means that suffering is not meaningless by definition. It becomes meaningful through interpretation, not through reward, but through form. Nietzsche believed that modern humanity had inherited a way of thinking that expected life to explain itself, to justify itself. But he believed that life does not explain. It expresses. It takes form through what it endures and what it creates. This is why he rejected the idea of a stable self. There is no finished human being. There is only a forming one. What we call identity is not an essence. It is a pattern of responses, a style of endurance, a way of shaping experience. When old meanings collapse, this process becomes visible. Without an external goal, life must justify itself from within, not by promising something later, but by giving shape now. Nietzsche did not think this would feel peaceful. Process is unstable. There is no final rest, no perfect harmony. But he believed this instability was closer to life than static ideals. To live as process is to accept that becoming never ends. There is no moment when one can say, "I am complete." There is only, "I am forming." This idea can feel unsettling. It removes the comfort of final answers, but it also removes the pressure of completion. Life does not need to reach perfection. It only needs to continue shaping itself. At night, this thought becomes softer. There is no goal to achieve, no future to secure, only breathing, only slowing, only the quiet sense that life does not need to arrive anywhere to be alive. The body does not wait for a final state to rest. It restores itself as part of movement. The heart does not aim for a conclusion. It keeps rhythm. In the same way, becoming does not require a destination. It requires time. Nietzsche believed that meaning does not come from reaching a point. It comes from how one moves, from the way effort is shaped, from the way resistance is endured, from the way life is interpreted. This is why he did not promise a future solution. He pointed to a different posture, not toward an answer, but toward a way of standing inside movement. Life as process is not something to master. It is something to inhabit. Tonight, you do not need to become anything. You do not need to move forward. It is enough to rest inside the awareness that life does not end in clarity. It continues in form. Sleep does not interrupt this forming. It belongs to it. And meaning, for now, does not need to be found at the end of a path. It can remain inside the movement of breath and thought slowing into stillness. It belongs to it. And meaning, for now, does not need to be found at the end of a path. It can remain inside the movement of breath and thought slowing into stillness. Nietzsche did not believe that suffering was an accident in human life. He believed it was woven into becoming itself, not as a punishment, not as a moral lesson, but as a condition of formation. When people imagine a meaningful life, they often imagine a life without pain, a life without conflict, a life without loss, a life without tension. Nietzsche saw this image as a misunderstanding of life. For him, suffering was not something that could be removed without changing what life is. Because life does not grow in smooth lines, it grows through resistance. Every form that appears is shaped by what opposes it. Without pressure, there is no contour. Without difficulty, there is no depth. Nietzsche did not glorify pain. He did not seek cruelty. He did not praise misery. But he believed that a life designed only to avoid suffering would also avoid becoming. When pain is treated only as something to eliminate, struggle becomes meaningless. Effort becomes mechanical. Endurance becomes pointless. The will weakens not because it is oppressed, but because it is no longer needed. Nietzsche thought that modern humanity was moving toward this condition, not because it suffered too much, but because it feared suffering too much. Comfort became a central value. Security replaced direction. Stability replaced striving. This did not make life empty. It made life flat. Without risk, there is no formation. Without danger, there is no shaping. Life continues, but it no longer sharpens itself. Nietzsche believed that suffering is not meaningful by itself. It becomes meaningful through interpretation. Two lives can suffer the same pain and become completely different. One collapses, the other transforms. The difference is not in the pain, but in how it is integrated. If suffering is seen as meaningless, it destroys. If suffering is seen as punishment, it humiliates. But if suffering is seen as part of becoming, it can give form. This does not justify suffering. It explains its role. Nietzsche did not want people to seek hardship. He wanted them not to flee from what shapes them. He believed that strength is not the absence of pain. It is the capacity to carry it without denying life. This is why he criticized moral systems that promise to remove suffering by escaping life. If life is seen as something to be endured only until it ends, then pain becomes intolerable. But if life is seen as something to be shaped, then pain becomes one of its forces. Nietzsche believed that religions and moralities often turned suffering into something sacred. They gave it meaning by connecting it to another world. He wanted to return suffering to this world, not as something holy, but as something formative. Life does not become valuable by escaping pain. It becomes valuable by using pain to form itself. This idea feels heavy because it removes comfort. It says, there is no final condition where struggle ends. There is no perfect state where pain disappears. Becoming is continuous, and continuous becoming means continuous tension. This does not mean constant agony. It means that life remains unfinished, unsettled, open. Nietzsche believed that a human being who expects peace as a final reward will resent life. They will feel cheated by every difficulty. They will see pain as injustice. But a human being who understands life as formation will see difficulty as part of shape, not as something desired, but as something that belongs. This does not remove sorrow. It changes its meaning. Pain is no longer only loss. It is also pressure. Pressure that reveals what can endure. Pressure that forces life to take form. This is why Nietzsche believed that eliminating suffering would also eliminate depth. Without sorrow, joy becomes thin. Without loss, attachment becomes weak. Without danger, courage disappears. Life becomes safe, but small. Nietzsche feared this smallness more than pain, not because pain is good, but because smallness is empty. He believed that a life without risk loses intensity. It does not burn. It only continues. When nihilism appears, this problem becomes sharper. If life has no given meaning and suffering is everywhere, then pain seems pointless. This is where nihilism becomes dangerous, not because it denies meaning, but because it cannot justify struggle. Nietzsche's response was not to remove pain, but to reorient it. To say, life is not justified by comfort. It is justified by becoming, and becoming passes through resistance. This is not optimism. It is not consolation. It is a way of standing inside difficulty without rejecting existence. At night, this thought becomes quiet. There is no suffering to explain, no struggle to overcome, only the awareness that life does not promise a painless path. But it does offer the possibility of form. The body rests not because pain has ended, but because it must recover. Breathing slows not because struggle is finished, but because rhythm continues. Suffering does not need to be solved before sleep. It does not need to be justified. It can simply be acknowledged as something that belongs to a life in motion, and motion, for now, can slow. The mind does not need to interpret pain tonight. It can let go of the question of why life hurts. It is enough to know that pain does not mean life has failed. It means life is still forming. Nietzsche did not understand growth as improvement according to a rule. He understood it as self-overcoming, not becoming better by comparison, but becoming different by transformation. Self-overcoming does not mean rejecting oneself. It means refusing to remain fixed. For Nietzsche, the danger was not weakness. The danger was stagnation. A life that repeats itself without reshaping itself slowly loses depth. This is why he spoke of overcoming not as conquest over others, but as movement within the self. The self is not a finished thing. It is a pattern of habits, values, and responses. To overcome oneself is to loosen these patterns when they no longer strengthen life. This does not happen through force. It happens through tension. Old ways of thinking resist change. Old desires pull back toward comfort. Old values offer stability. Self-overcoming means remaining with this tension instead of escaping it. It is the moment when a person recognizes that what once gave structure now limits growth. Nietzsche did not believe that this moment would feel heroic. He believed it would feel difficult. To question one's own values is harder than to follow them. To reshape oneself is harder than to obey. This is why most people prefer certainty to becoming. They want to know who they are instead of allowing themselves to change. But Nietzsche believed that identity is not something to protect. It is something to form. Self-overcoming is not self-denial. It is not sacrifice for an external ideal. It is not obedience to a moral code. It is the reorganization of one's drives and interpretations. Nietzsche believed that every human being is made of competing forces: desire and restraint, fear and courage, habit and aspiration. These forces do not disappear. They must be shaped. To overcome oneself is not to eliminate drives, but to give them form, not to suppress energy, but to orient it. This is why Nietzsche criticized moral systems that demanded self-control as repression. They weakened life instead of strengthening it. Self-overcoming does not destroy desire. It refines it. It does not silence instinct. It educates it. It does not flatten emotion. It gives it direction. When nihilism appears, self-overcoming becomes necessary. Without inherited values, the self is exposed. It no longer knows which tendencies to follow and which to resist. This creates confusion. But Nietzsche saw this confusion as opportunity, not to invent a new morality, but to reshape the self according to strength. Strength, for Nietzsche, did not mean dominance. It meant the capacity to endure tension without collapsing into comfort. It meant the ability to remain engaged with difficulty without fleeing into numbness. Self-overcoming is slow. It does not happen through sudden decisions. It happens through repeated interpretation, through asking, does this way of living expand or shrink me? Does this habit strengthen or weaken my engagement? Does this value allow me to endure my life or make me resent it? These questions do not produce universal answers. They produce personal orientation. Nietzsche did not want a rule that applies to everyone. He wanted a movement that reshapes each life differently. Self-overcoming is not imitation. It is not becoming like another. It is becoming more fully what one can endure to be. This does not mean discovering a hidden essence. It means shaping one's form of life through choice and struggle. Nietzsche believed that suffering plays a role here, not as punishment, but as pressure. Pressure reveals what can be transformed and what must be left behind. Self-overcoming does not remove pain. It reorganizes it. Pain becomes part of shaping rather than a reason to withdraw. This does not make life easy. It makes it serious. A serious life is not a heavy life. It is a life that does not hide from itself. Self-overcoming is not a goal. It is a posture, a way of remaining open to transformation, a refusal to settle into final answers about who one is. Nietzsche believed that modern humanity was in danger of becoming satisfied too quickly, not because it had achieved much, but because it feared change. Comfort becomes identity. Security becomes value. But this produces a life that is safe and unfinished. Self-overcoming interrupts this safety. It does not promise happiness. It promises movement. Movement away from stagnation. Movement toward form. At night, this idea becomes quiet. There is no self to overcome now, no habit to change, no value to question, only the awareness that life does not need to stay as it is to be itself. The body rests not to remain the same, but to restore itself for further movement. Breath slows not to stop, but to continue. Self-overcoming does not require constant effort. It requires rhythm. Periods of tension and periods of rest, struggle and release. Tonight, you do not need to transform anything. You do not need to improve yourself. It is enough to notice that life is not static. It reshapes itself through time. And that becoming does not demand a final image. It only demands the willingness to not remain exactly where one is. Sleep belongs to this movement. It is not escape. It is renewal, and renewal is already a quiet form of overcoming. When old values lose their authority, creation becomes unavoidable. Not creation as invention of fantasies, but creation as orientation. Nietzsche did not believe that human beings could live without values. He believed they could no longer live by inherited ones. This is where responsibility begins. Not responsibility to a law, not to a tradition, not to a moral code. Responsibility to one's own becoming. To create values is not to announce rules. It is to shape a way of living that can be endured. Nietzsche understood values not as abstract ideas, but as lived priorities. What one repeats, what one sacrifices for, what one organizes life around. These are values, whether they are named or not. When inherited meaning collapses, these priorities do not disappear. They become visible. Creation, in this sense, is not an act of imagination. It is an act of clarification, to see what already governs life and to decide whether it strengthens or weakens becoming. This is why Nietzsche thought creation after nihilism would feel heavy, not because it demands genius, but because it removes excuses. No tradition can be blamed. No authority can be obeyed. The individual must answer for the form of their life. This does not mean everyone must become a philosopher. It means no one can hide behind borrowed meaning. Creation is responsibility because it cannot be delegated. No one else can decide what a life should affirm. Nietzsche did not imagine that new values would appear through agreement. He did not trust collective solutions. Groups seek stability. Creation requires tension. He believed new orientations would come from individuals who could endure the absence of inherited meaning without fleeing into comfort. Creation does not mean that anything can be valued. It means that values must be tested in life. A value that weakens endurance is not a value for becoming. A value that encourages resentment is not a value for affirmation. A value that depends on escape is not a value for life. Nietzsche believed that values must be measured by their effect on the will to become. Do they deepen engagement? Do they increase capacity? Do they allow struggle to take form? Creation is responsibility because it requires saying yes to consequences. A created value is not protected by tradition. It stands alone with the life that lives by it. If it weakens life, it must be abandoned. If it strengthens life, it must be carried. This is why Nietzsche rejected universal moral systems. They promise security. They remove the need to choose. But in doing so, they also remove the need to shape. Creation, for Nietzsche, is not about originality. It is about seriousness. To take one's life as something that must be formed, not justified by another world, not excused by necessity. Formed. This responsibility can feel overwhelming. Without commandments, there is no guarantee. Without heaven, there is no reward. Only the shape of one's existence remains. Nietzsche believed that many people would avoid this responsibility. They would return to old values in new language. They would adopt ideologies. They would seek identities. They would cling to systems that promise certainty. This is not weakness. It is fear of exposure. Creation exposes life to itself. It removes protective stories. It asks, can this life be affirmed as it is being lived? Not as it should be, not as it will be, but as it unfolds. This is why creation is not optimism. It does not promise happiness. It promises form, a form that can endure repetition. Nietzsche believed that only a life that can be repeated without resentment has been well formed. This does not mean that pain disappears. It means that pain belongs to a shape that can be carried. Creation as responsibility does not remove struggle. It gives struggle a place, not as punishment, but as part of becoming. This is what Nietzsche meant by giving style to one's life. Not decorating it, but shaping it. Not explaining it, but forming it. Style is not appearance, it is organization, how energy is directed, how effort is distributed, how tension is held. Creation is not a moment, it is a way of continuing. Each decision either strengthens or weakens the form that is emerging. This is why creation cannot be rushed. It grows through repetition, through what is chosen again and again. Nietzsche believed that meaning would not return as a doctrine. It would return as orientation, not something to believe, but something to live. At night, this responsibility does not need to be carried. There is no value to create now, no direction to decide, only the awareness that life does not wait for permission to take shape. Breath continues. The heart keeps rhythm. The body restores itself. Even without decisions, form emerges. Creation does not pause when thought rests. It continues quietly through time. Tonight, you do not need to choose what matters. You do not need to shape your life. It is enough to recognize that after meaning collapses, life does not disappear. It waits, not for rules, not for doctrines, but for a form that can be endured. And endurance, for now, can take the form of sleep. Nietzsche did not think that life should be accepted because it is pleasant. He believed it must be affirmed because it is one's own becoming. To affirm life is not to praise it. It is not to call it good. It is not to say that everything is justified. Affirmation, for Nietzsche, means something quieter and heavier. It means to live without rejecting existence itself, not to escape it, not to explain it away, not to treat it as a mistake, but to remain with it. When nihilism appears, life feels as if it has lost its reason, not its movement, not its sensations, but its justification. People continue to live, but no longer know why they should. Affirmation does not answer this question with an idea. It answers it with posture. A way of standing inside life without demanding that life prove itself. Nietzsche believed that modern humanity was trained to look for reasons outside life. In religion, meaning came from another world. In morality, meaning came from obedience. In progress, meaning came from the future. When these weaken, life is left exposed. Affirmation begins when one no longer asks life to justify itself by something beyond it. Not heaven, not history, not ideals. Only existence remains. To affirm life is to say, this movement, this struggle, this forming is enough to stand in. Not because it is perfect, but because it is real. Nietzsche believed that the deepest form of nihilism is not hatred of life. It is indifference. To live without rejection, but also without affirmation. To continue without engagement. Affirmation is the opposite of this. It is not joy. It is intensity. It is the willingness to say yes to the process of becoming even when it is difficult. This does not mean celebrating pain. It means not using pain as an argument against life. Suffering does not invalidate existence. It belongs to it. Loss does not cancel becoming. It reshapes it. Affirmation does not deny hardship. It refuses to treat hardship as proof that life should not be lived. Nietzsche did not imagine affirmation as peace. He imagined it as strength. Not strength over others, but strength to remain inside tension, to endure contradiction, to live without final answers. Affirmation is not agreement with fate. It is intimacy with it. To say, this is my path not because it is good, but because it is mine. This does not isolate the individual. It deepens them. A life that is only obeyed remains thin. A life that is affirmed becomes dense. Affirmation does not ask, is this allowed? It asks, can I endure this as my form? Nietzsche believed that resentment was the enemy of affirmation. Resentment appears when life is judged from a position of weakness, when pain is interpreted as injustice, when struggle is seen as insult. Affirmation replaces this with responsibility. Not moral responsibility, but existential responsibility. To live in such a way that one does not secretly wish life were different. Not easier, not smoother, not safer, but otherwise. This does not mean wanting pain. It means not wanting a different world to justify this one. Nietzsche believed that this posture could only arise after nihilism. As long as meaning is inherited, life is justified by something else. Only when that something else collapses can life be affirmed for itself. This is why nihilism was not only danger, it was condition. Without the collapse of old meanings, affirmation would not be free. It would still be obedience. Affirmation is not belief. It is stance. Not what one thinks, but how one stands inside existence. This stance does not remove doubt. It does not remove suffering. It does not remove fear. It reorganizes them. Fear becomes part of courage. Doubt becomes part of seriousness. Pain becomes part of form. Life is no longer something to escape. It is something to inhabit. This does not create certainty. It creates presence. At night, this idea becomes gentle. There is no need to affirm life in thought. There is no need to decide that existence is good. Only the fact of breathing remains. The body affirms itself by continuing. The heart affirms itself by keeping rhythm. The mind can rest without judgment. Affirmation does not require a declaration. It requires endurance. And endurance, for now, can take the form of stillness. You do not need to say yes to your life tonight. You do not need to resolve its meaning. It is enough to not reject it, to let it be as it is. The night does not demand belief. It only holds what exists. And what exists does not need to be justified to be lived. Affirmation does not shout. It remains as a quiet agreement to stay, to remain inside becoming without asking for a final answer. Nietzsche's phrase, "becoming what you are," does not point to a hidden essence. It does not mean discovering a true self that has been waiting inside. It means something more demanding. It means shaping a form of life through struggle, interpretation, and endurance. For Nietzsche, the self is not something found. It is something formed, not chosen in advance, but created through how one lives. When nihilism appears, the idea of a fixed identity weakens. Without inherited meaning, there is no stable image of what a human should be. This can feel like loss, but Nietzsche saw it as opening. To become what one is means to take responsibility for the shape of one's existence without borrowing its form from tradition. It does not mean becoming unique for the sake of difference. It means becoming coherent. A life in which one's values, actions, and endurance belong together. Nietzsche believed that many people live as collections of habits rather than as formed lives. They follow routines without asking whether these routines express their strength or weaken it. To become what one is to move away from imitation. Not imitation of others, but imitation of inherited models, moral ideals, social expectations, fixed roles. These give stability, but they also give shape from the outside. Nietzsche wanted shape to grow from within life, not from rules, but from engagement. This does not mean following impulses blindly. It means organizing them. Nietzsche believed that every person contains conflicting forces: fear and courage, desire and restraint, habit and aspiration. To become what one is to arrange these forces into a style of life, not suppressing them but giving them form. This is why Nietzsche spoke of style as something ethical, not decoration but structure, a way of enduring life without resentment. Becoming what you are is not about success. It is not about recognition. It is not about reaching a goal. It is about continuity, about living in such a way that one's life can be repeated without rejection. Nietzsche believed that resentment was the sign of a life that does not fit itself. When a person secretly wishes their life were different, they are not becoming what they are. They are enduring a form that does not belong to them. This does not mean that life should be easy. It means that struggle should be one's own, not imposed by borrowed values, not justified by another world, but shaped from within existence itself. Nietzsche did not imagine that becoming would be calm. It requires tension between what one has been and what one can endure to become, between habit and transformation, between safety and form. This is why he thought modern humanity was standing at a critical point. Old identities were weakening. New ones had not yet formed. People felt free and disoriented at the same time. Becoming what you are is not solving this confusion. It is living inside it without fleeing, not by inventing a new doctrine, but by forming a life that does not rely on borrowed meaning. Nietzsche believed that only a person who has passed through nihilism can truly begin this process. Before nihilism, identity is inherited. After nihilism, identity must be shaped. This shaping does not happen through ideas alone. It happens through repetition, through what is chosen again and again, through what is endured without resentment, through what is affirmed as one's own path. Becoming what you are is not a command. It is not a task to complete. It is a way of standing inside movement, not trying to freeze the self, but allowing it to take form through time. Nietzsche believed that human beings often want to escape this responsibility. They seek stable labels, fixed meanings, clear identities. These protect against uncertainty, but they also protect against becoming. To remain inside a label is to stop forming. To become what you are is to remain open to transformation. This does not mean endless change. It means faithful change. Change that grows from one's own life rather than from pressure. Nietzsche did not promise that this path would bring peace. He believed it would bring intensity. A life that fits itself is not necessarily comfortable, but it is coherent. Its struggles belong to it. Its pain has form. Its effort has direction. This is what Nietzsche meant by a higher form of existence, not higher in status, not higher in power, higher in responsibility. A life that can say, "This is my becoming," not because it was chosen easily, but because it was shaped honestly. At night, this idea becomes quiet. There is no identity to shape now, no self to decide, only the body slowing into rest. Breath continues without instruction. The heart keeps rhythm without asking who it should be. Becoming what you are does not require constant awareness. It requires time, and time for now can pass inside sleep. You do not need to know who you are. You do not need to define yourself. It is enough to let life continue shaping itself without resistance. Meaning does not need to be discovered tonight. Identity does not need to be formed. The night does not demand a self. It only holds what is becoming, and becoming, for now, can be still. Nietzsche did not leave behind a final teaching. He did not offer a system to follow. He did not present a doctrine to believe. He did not give a formula for meaning. What he left was a movement, not a destination, but a direction, a way of standing inside a world where inherited meaning has weakened. Beyond nihilism, there is no new certainty waiting. There is only a road, not a clear path, not a marked route, a road that forms as one walks it. Nietzsche believed that this was the condition of modern existence. No longer guided by unquestioned truths, no longer carried by inherited purposes. Human beings are left with the task of shaping their own form of life. Not once, not completely, but continuously. This is why he did not promise peace. Peace suggests an end. He spoke instead of becoming, of self-overcoming, of creation, of affirmation. These are not answers. They are postures, ways of remaining inside life without demanding that life resolve itself. Beyond nihilism does not mean that doubt disappears. It means that doubt no longer paralyzes movement. It does not mean that suffering ends. It means that suffering is no longer used as an argument against existence. It does not mean that identity becomes clear. It means that identity is allowed to form through time. Nietzsche did not want human beings to escape uncertainty. He wanted them to endure it without retreating into comfort or illusion. This endurance is not heroic. It is quiet. It shows itself in how one lives without borrowed meaning, in how one continues without guarantees, in how one shapes a life that can be carried without resentment. There is no final image of what one should become. There is no universal form of a good life. There is only the question of whether one can say yes to one's own becoming, not because it is easy, not because it is justified, but because it is one's own. Nietzsche did not imagine this as happiness. He imagined it as seriousness, a seriousness that does not hide behind beliefs, a seriousness that does not escape into future rewards, a seriousness that stays with what is. This does not make life light. It makes it honest. And honesty, for Nietzsche, was not confession. It was form, to give shape to one's existence without pretending it belongs to something else, not to another world, not to a final goal, not to an external law, only to becoming. The road beyond nihilism is not about progress. It is not about improvement. It is not about solving the problem of meaning. It is about living without demanding that the problem be solved, to walk without a map, to move without certainty, to shape a life without inheritance. This does not require constant effort. It requires patience, patience with uncertainty, patience with oneself, patience with time. Nietzsche believed that time itself is part of becoming, not something to escape, but something that forms. A life does not take shape in moments of clarity. It takes shape in repetition, in what is endured, in what is returned to, in what is not abandoned when comfort would be easier. Beyond nihilism, there is no sudden transformation. There is only a slow forming. This is why Nietzsche did not speak of salvation. He spoke of style, not style as appearance, but style as coherence, a way of living in which effort, desire, and endurance belong together, a life that does not secretly wish itself away, a life that does not wait for another world to justify this one. This does not mean that life must be praised. It means that life is no longer rejected. It is allowed to remain unfinished. At night, this unfinishedness becomes gentle. There is no demand to become something now, no task to define the self, no value to create, only the movement of breath, the rhythm of the heart, the quiet passage of time. The road does not need to be seen. It does not need to be understood. It only needs to remain open. Beyond nihilism is not a place. It is a way of continuing, a way of standing inside a world that no longer tells us what to become. And this does not require an answer. It only requires that one does not turn away from the question. Tonight, you do not need to walk this road. You do not need to choose direction. You do not need to become anything. It is enough to rest inside the awareness that life does not need a final meaning to continue, that becoming does not need a destination. That movement can slow without stopping. The road remains even in stillness, and stillness for now can take the form of sleep, not as escape, not as solution, but as part of becoming itself.